Hi, Econ 345. Hope you're doing well. Just so you know, this will be a slightly shorter video today because we also have a second video you need to watch this week. It's the one that's going to outline the project that you're going to be doing over the semester. So that's going to be in a separate folder about projects. So feel free to look out for that. I hope everybody's doing super well today and they're excited about this topic. It's one of the ones that I really enjoy because it's one of the reasons why I'm a public economist to even begin with. I really enjoy studying externalities. So I hope everybody has a great time and they find this at least interesting. So let's start out on this. Let's think of one of like the classic examples of externalities that public economists use. Global warming. It's kind of apt right now, right? Because we've had so many hurricanes that we're running out of names. Like we literally are about to have to go to like the Greek alphabet, which hasn't happened but once in all of history, right? There's orange skies in California, partially because they don't do controlled burns because of cost-cutting measures, because of lobbying and other things that are happening, but also because like society's kind of just getting worse when it comes to a global sphere, which makes them more endangered by droughts and by lack of rain. Okay, then we also have like this meme. This happened like last week, and this is actually real. Because of a cold front that came through, you know, that random snow that happened in Colorado. Well, what happened down in Texas was part of the state was below freezing, while the other part of the state was above 100. What's up with that? So this is like a classic example of externalities. It's when people have made decisions, because we make decisions to, for example, I drive an SUV. I make that decision. Other people choose to produce steel in an inefficient way, and other people decide to have uncontrollable burns in their backyard without a permit. All of us kind of make a lot of these decisions that end up just making global warming worse, right? And because we do that, there's effects that are happening to other people besides ourselves. I'm not necessarily paying a cost for the snow that different parts of Colorado are going through in early September, but it's partially caused by all of our behavior. So what's really hard is, as a society, trying to balance where the costs are and the causes of the cost, and how do we bring those two together? Because sometimes society, the demand and supply of society, is inherently different from the supply and demand as us, as private individuals. All right, so introduction to the kind of the externalities back on the global warming train. Back in 2015, representatives for 195 nations met in Paris, France to negotiate the International Pact to limit temperature rises around the world. Turns out carbon dioxide emissions are bad and they hurt the environment. There's lots of science for that, and if you want to debate me on it, feel free to email me, and I have papers that I can show you related to this that you know are their science. Okay, and then we've kind of gotten to the point where we realize some predictions are just insane. Like some of them are just like, okay, we have to get back to pre-industrial levels if we're going to stop climate change. Well, that means we're going to have to get to the point where we make green technology planes or switch back to trains, or maybe not travel as much, or maybe we're going to have to massively cut electricity in certain parts of the place or in the world, and rolling things. You know, the rolling electrical blackouts, that's what I'm talking about. There might be other sorts of things. So these are things that we really have to think about, because if we don't get more fuel efficient, then those would be some of the drastic measures that we would have to take. Well, that's certainly a cost that we would have to bear to correct some sort of externality that's happening. So we've seen temperatures have been rising over time. And it's something that needs to eventually be addressed, because externalities are happening that are affecting millions and billions of people because of the decisions that we're making as a collective, which is why governments got together in this point to be able to negotiate an international pact. Because even if we have 7-point-something billion people that all say, you know what, I'm going to make better decisions. Like, for example, I compost and I do a bunch of other stuff and I try to make the world a slightly better place. I don't eat meat. Even if we all decided to make those sorts of decisions, we can't coordinate together very well. That's almost impossible to do. So that's why sometimes we need representatives to work together for these end goals. Now, does that mean that this is efficient? Not always. Does it mean that it's representing the beliefs and experiences of everybody? No. But it's one of the only ways that sometimes we can make global forces work together to try to come out to some sort of end result that might be beneficial for society. So how do we bring together the supply and demand of individuals and the supply and demand of society. How do we balance the two of those? Now, that's such an important and crucial thing to think about. So let's start off with some terminology. There's a couple definitions that you need in this. First off is externalities, right? Externalities are the inherent bad or good that's happening to society that you don't necessarily pay the cost for. If I had a steel company and I threw all of my pollution into the river, I'm not necessarily bearing the cost of like all the households that now have a polluted water supply. I don't really have to pay for that, but they're paying for it, right? It's a bad that's happening to them that I'm not necessarily paying for. If I decided to go through and just like smoke a cigarette in a giant group of people, well, that could have health outcomes or implications for them because of something that I'm consuming. And I'm not paying their doctor bills when later they might have an asthma attack and go to the hospital. I'm not paying their doctor bills. But it's based off a decision that I made. So these are different sort of negative externalities that are happening. Now there's also positive externalities. Sometimes there's good that happens. Like maybe there's really just a good company that ends up making something that like is out of recycled plastic so that they're making the world a slightly cleaner place. So every time that they produce something, the world gets a little bit cleaner, and maybe we don't always pay them for that, but they're doing it. Maybe if people get flu shots on a regular basis or wear a mask in public, that could have benefits to other people because they're not as likely to get sick or get the flu or get COVID. But if I do those things, if I get a flu shot and if I wear a mask, I don't necessarily get paid by people for the benefit that I'm providing them either. So externalities are things where a cost or benefit is given to someone else, and the person who's causing the externality doesn't necessarily bear the cost or benefit. Now, this means that there's private supply and demand and society supply and demand that don't necessarily match. Sometimes I want to produce more steel and poison the river than society really wants me to do. We call these market failures. Market failures are problems that are caused by just these inefficiencies because we can't necessarily come to an outcome that's maximizing the well-being of everyone. So when market failures arise, and when there's particularly bad market failures, we have to figure out how we're going to correct for those. So let's talk about two different types of negative externalities, all right? So I already told you that these are costs that are borne by other people, but what I didn't tell you is that they come in two different forms. The first is negative production externalities. So negative production externalities is when I'm producing something and I'm giving a cost to someone else. For example, I'm producing steel and I dump some of the pollution into the river and it hurts the fishermen. That's not a cost that I deal with. Let me show you what that looks like on a graph. Let's see. So right here, let's say that we're going to look at this one on the right. I went ahead and kind of drew these out ahead of time. We got our price, we got our quantity. This is our private marginal cost. So this right here, this point, this is exactly where I would operate if it were only up to me as the steel producer and the people buying my steel. I would be here where maybe I might sell 5,000 things of steel for, ooh, it is so hard to draw straight on this thing, $30. I know there's the person in this class who told me to use OneNote instead. I still haven't done that, as you can obviously see. So I will eventually get to that. Until then, we have this. So with the negative production externality, producing means supply, right? Because in the supply, I'm producing something. So we're going to see a shift in our supply side. Now, a negative production externality means that there's actually more cost. Ooh, no, that looked bad. Where is the... more cost to society, right? So there's going to be this social marginal cost, we call it SMC, that's going to be above what my private marginal cost is. That's just my private marginal cost plus this difference right here. What this difference represents is the damage that's being done to others because of this decision. Now, if it were just me, this is where supply and demand would equal up. If it's society, this is where supply and demand would equal. Notice that those aren't the same thing. We have some sort of market failure that has arisen in the system. So that means that there's deadweight loss that has been created. What does that look like? Whenever I tell you about deadweight loss, what you're going to do is you're going to see these 2 points. You're going to be like, ah, I can make a triangle. You go to the original point. You draw a line from the original point to the new line of social marginal cost or social marginal benefit. This works whether demand shifts or supply shifts. And then you're going to fill in that line. This line represents our deadweight loss. Because at society, if I cared about society's costs, maybe we would only produce 4,000 and we'd make them a little bit more expensive. Maybe we would sell them for $35 each. So maybe we'd have a higher price and a lower quantity if we included the cost that is being borne by the people down the river from having a poisoned river supply. So this deadweight loss represents trades that are happening that shouldn't necessarily happen. That's what it looks like for a negative production externality. Now let's go to the other side. We have negative consumption externalities. So this is when something bad happens because I'm consuming something. Maybe I have a really, really loud car stereo and then I'm driving down, you know, the road and my loud car stereo, it's bothering the houses, it's shaking foundations because it's a really good stereo. Babies are crying, dogs are barking, people are upset, and that's because I'm consuming. I'm listening to my music and I am real happy, but there's a cost that's being borne by other people for my enjoyment, right? What does that look like when we break it to the graph? Well, let's look at this left-hand side. Now, consumption, that's consuming something. When we're consuming something, we're talking about demand. So if it's a production externality, we're looking at supply. When it's a consumption externality, we're looking at demand. So let's get the blue back on here. Society might not like my music as much, right? If it's just me, I'm demanding this much music. So maybe us as a society, we would have 1,000 super loud speakers for, I don't know, $100, right? Okay. Now let's think about society. You know what, we're gonna do this one in kind of this blue. That's a pretty blue. Well, society, because they have this initial or this additional detracting piece, they're not exactly happy with it. Well, society's demand is going to be lower if we start thinking about the cost that we're really putting on other people. So maybe society is right here. Maybe this is actually the amount that we would have if we factored in the damage that we were doing to people, and maybe we would have 80 loudspeakers instead for a slightly lower price because there's less and it's cheaper to produce if we have less things. So what do we do? Well, you'll be like, Dr. Plemmons told me to go to this original point, so this original point right here, draw a line to the new point or to the new line. So just go straight up or down till you hit the new line, fill that in. What we see here, this is deadweight loss. This is another one where we end up producing more than what's necessarily best for society because we have our private marginal benefit, which is our originally demand line. Then we have society's marginal benefit. Society's marginal benefit is less than my private benefit. If we listen to society, we would have less quantity and we do it for a cheaper price. We'd be operating right here. This represents loss in economic value of consumer and producer surplus that's happening because we are producing at a level that isn't optimal for society and we're damaging some people in a way that we are not factoring into the market. How cool is that? That's so neat. All right, so we have our negative production externality and our negative consumption externality. And there's negative externalities everywhere. Once you start like paying attention to, wow, that person's annoying that other person, I bet they're not benefiting from them. There's no corrective tax when you just have a really loud speaker going down the road, right? There are negative externalities everywhere, and you start to notice them and you have to start to think about them. Now, these are just the things that we've already talked about. So if we go back to this, we'll see that on the left-hand side, when I was talking about a change in consumption externalities, we had our private marginal benefit and our social marginal benefit represented by PMB and SMB. On the right-hand side is cost. So this is from our production externality because we see that supply has been shifted. We have society's marginal cost in the blue and our private marginal cost in the black. When I say private marginal benefit or private marginal cost, I am talking about the supply and demand when we do not care about the harm we are doing to others. If we are thinking about only how much I want to buy and sell of my steel company, but I am not considering at all the people who I'm poisoning down the road, that's private marginal benefit and cost. If I start thinking about, ooh, okay, so that's my private one, that's how much it cost me, but now let's like also factor in the cost of poisoning all these people, like that's probably not good. So once we consider that cost too, then we have our social marginal cost and our social marginal benefits. So those represent where society would prefer us be when we start thinking about the costs that aren't necessarily related to our own adventures, right? The other side of this will be when we look at positive production externalities and positive consumption externalities. I'm not going to draw those out because you get to do it either in your homework or test. So that's gonna be fun. That's gonna be fun. I would, spend some time thinking about, well, what if this went the other direction? Because if it was a positive consumption externality, then or production externality, then our costs would actually, not be as bad as we would think, because there'd be good happening to the world. So this would actually shift this way. Maybe for the other side, if we were thinking about a positive consumption externality, well, the world actually wants us to do more of it. So we would instead shift demand the other way. Okie dokie. So our private marginal cost just represents the direct cost to producers. That's the one that's happening to just me. Social marginal cost is the private marginal cost to the producers plus any costs that are associated with producing this good, so that externality bit. On the other side, when we look at private marginal benefit is the direct benefit to consumers. How much I get from having that loudspeaker, how much like happiness I get, how in the society for loudspeakers where we don't care about the people that are annoyed by them, how much would we supply and demand? Well, on the other side, we have the social marginal benefit. That's the amount that would be supplied and demanded if we actually considered how we were affecting other people. Isn't that neat? So these are just the same graphs that I already did. Feel free to go through them if you want. But then you're probably saying, what do we even do about negative externalities? Like, this sounds kind of bad. People are being damaged. Why does it matter that I can put it on a graph? Well, because there's ways that we can correct for them. There's ways that we can try to make the world a slightly better place, right? Now, are all of these efficient? No, they're not. Because it's very difficult to figure out exactly what the cost is. If I'm a steel company and I'm polluting the river, it's almost impossible to find an exact number for how much I am affecting every single household in that river, and how much I'm affecting the biosphere of that river, and how many fish have died, and how much value they had, and so on and so forth. Calculating that is difficult. And because we do not know an exact number, we do not know the exact size of a shift, we can come up with policy corrections that push us in one direction or another, but we don't know if it's going to be for the same magnitude as what we had. So a couple things that we have in our toolkit for dealing with negative externalities. We have environmental taxation. So, hey, if you pollute the river, we're going to tax you. Okay, well, if you're going to tax me for polluting the river and that's really expensive, then maybe I'll just clean up my factory and learn how to do something in a less damaging way, because now it's either pay the tax, which is high price, or clean the company, which is also high price. Now I'm kind of debating in between the two instead of just polluting. There's carbon emissions trading. That's another one. That's the idea of we don't necessarily need to know the cost of pollution. We've decided that as a society, we can handle 6,000 units of pollution. Well, if we can handle 6,000 units of pollution, I go around and I tell every company, you can pollute 100, you can pollute 100, you can pollute 200, you can pollute 100, and I let them trade amongst themselves. It turns out that they'll still keep us at 600 units of pollution, but then the companies, they'll rearrange who can have the carbon emissions by who really needs it, right? If I'm a really clean company and I don't really need 100 units of pollution, then I can sell them off and make some money. If I'm a really dirty company and it's very expensive for me to clean my equipment and make it more environmentally friendly, well, that's costly for me. So I'm going to be willing to pay for those essentially tickets for emissions so that I can pollute a lot. I'll buy them from that clean factory. And at the end of the day, we're moving them amongst ourselves. We're deciding our own prices for these tickets, but there's still only 600 units of pollution. It's actually a beautiful policy idea. Then there's pollution regulation. So a lot of places will be like, oh, you can pollute, but you can't pollute this sort of material, this sort of metal. It has to be under this certain amount of this other type of metal. So there's lots of different things that we can do, especially for environmental related negative externalities. Now, it's not all bad, right? There's good parts too. Like, not all externalities are doom and gloom. It's just the most prevalent ones are doom and gloom. But we have a couple like good ones that we can think about. Let's think about a positive production externality. So when a firm produces or production increases the well-being of others. So instead of harming others, we actually make others well off by what we're producing. What if, let's see, what's a good example? It's always hard to think of one of these. The positive examples are less common than the negative examples. Let's say that we're a bead company and we're making our beads out of ocean plastic. Well, we're just buying and selling things. We have our normal supply and demand for, you know, my private marginal cost of how much it really, you know, causes me in cost to make these little beads. What I'm not considering and how I'm not adjusting for, because I'm not really getting paid for it, is the good of society. Society loves when I clean the ocean to make my little beads. They wish that I would do more and make more beads and have them for a different price so that more people could have them because I'm cleaning the ocean. That's a positive production externality. It has the opposite shift of the graph that we saw earlier. And another idea is a consumption externality. So production is when I'm producing something, it affects supply. Consumption is when I'm consuming something, it affects demand. So a positive consumption externality, let's think about it. If I wear a mask, okay, if I wear a really good mask to class and I'm teaching in my mask, then my students are less likely to get sick. When I decide, or when we have the demand and supply for masks, and I buy some masks, the amount of masks that I'm buying is dependent on how many I think I'll need. I'm not necessarily factoring in the monetary value of all the good I'm doing for my students when they don't get sick. Stormy! This is Stormy the cat. We love Stormy the cat. She's so great. Yes, you're cute. I know, you're trying to escape. Okay, goodbye. Positive consumption externalities are when there's good things that happen to the world, and maybe we want to incentivize more of it. So instead of making a tax, maybe we'll try to subsidize, maybe we'll try to encourage it. So the positive consumption externality is the same as the other consumption externality, the negative case, but we shift the other direction because we want to encourage more of it. Society actually gets more benefit from me having a mask and from all of us having masks than what we personally get out of benefit for wearing masks. So, like I said, here's one example in your notes, but these you're going to have to work out on your homework and tests, so I'm not going to go into them. But go through the same logic that I used in the negative case, reverse it, and think about the positive case. So what do we have in the toolkit? The government toolkit for positive externalities. Well, these are things that we want more of. We would like more students on campus to wear masks. We would like for more people to clean the ocean when they're making their beads. So what do? Well, some things that we can do is we can subsidize environmental subsidies. We can go around to all the companies that are making beads out of ocean trash and say, hey, every bead that you make, we'll pay like 10 cents of that. Subsidizing them, and we'll be like, oh wow, then we can make so many more, and then we'll do more. So that's one idea. There can be special designation for green companies. We see this for like the lead ones. I forgot what the other one is. Energy Star. It's like special recognitions that buildings can get for being particularly green. Okay. That actually does tend to work pretty well because it turns out customers really like going to green buildings. The problem is the companies that are most likely to go green are ones that don't actually have customers coming to their building. But that's an entire other set of literature. If you ever are interested, let me know. One of my friends does that study and I can send you over that way. We could be hired for additional government work. Maybe the government needs beads for something, who knows what, but instead of going to the inefficient company or the company that's causing pollution, maybe they'll go to the one that's like cleaning the oceans, making these beads out of ocean stuff. Maybe I can give them tax breaks or tax credits. I can that, which kind of works as a subsidy, right? If I'm saying, okay, you can make your beads and I'm going to give you a tax break on your taxes, then I'll be like, hey, that means I have more capital to spend. I have more money kind of in my pocket really at the end of the day. So that works kind of as a subsidy where I can produce more now. So we have toolkits to both incentivize and detract from a lot of behavior. So we have these externalities, and you're probably wondering, well, why government? Fair question, right? Because government's not always the most efficient method at solving a problem. But sometimes they're the only way to solve a problem. So let me tell you about something. So private sectors can actually fix externalities pretty well. We call this the Coase theorem. It's the idea that private parties will be able to solve the problem of externalities, and it's accomplished by internalizing the externality. So let's say that we have a homeowners association. So maybe the picture on the left. We have this homeowners association because this neighborhood, maybe this neighborhood has a bad dumping problem where people are dumping things into the river out back. Well, what they can do is they can all work together. They work together because they say, you know, we don't want to get the police involved. We don't want to get the government involved. Instead, us as homeowners, we're going to get together. We're going to come up with this club. We're going to call it a homeowners association. And we're going to pay someone to clean the river back there, but I'm going to need like $20 from everybody. So it's putting this new cost on everybody in a way that we're working together. And then we have enough money to clean the river. It internalizes the externality because everybody has to kind of pay that $20 and the river's cleaner. But notice when that works. That works when we have only a few houses. It works when we have only a small neighborhood. It works when we have a small number of buyers and sellers. There's low transaction costs. We're able to communicate with each other. I'm able to go over to Anne's house next door and say, hey, Anne, I noticed the river's a mess. What should we do about it? But that doesn't necessarily work on a global scale, right? I can't go to someone's house in Siberia or Dar es Salaam or anywhere else in the world. I can't necessarily go to their houses and say, hey, I need you to, like, what should we do about this pollution? How about we put some money together and we build a windmill? I can't do that as easily. So when we start thinking about these big problems, let's think about affordable housing. Kind of the picture on the right, because that's actually from an affordable housing building. There's what, 40 million Americans who can't necessarily afford rent or mortgages in most major cities. So they need a place to live so that we don't have rampant homelessness and people who are unable to get the supplies that they need to be able to function in their lives and things. So some developers get together with government, and government says, hey, we'll help subsidize this because we need more affordable housing in these areas so that these people have a place to live, so that they're not homeless and they can still have their children go to schools and stuff. And we're gonna subsidize you as a person who's building these complexes, and that's good. All right, so we've corrected for the externality. But the thing is, I can't do that. I can't just go around the neighborhood and start saying, hey, everyone, pitch in some money because we got to help build some affordable housing down the road. That's very difficult to do, especially because we're not just talking about here, right? We're talking about every major city and town in the United States has some sort of need for affordable housing. That's something that I can't coordinate from my basement. It's a pretty cool basement. If I knew that I was going to be spending my entire life down here teaching, I would have decorated it better. But I can't organize the world of affordable housing from my basement. It just doesn't work that way. So sometimes the private sector will fail to fix an externality. If it's something that you can do with a limited number of people and transaction costs are low and the ability to communicate is there and you're able to work together, you can certainly fix an externality with a private sector. You totally can. You do not need government intervention for every single one of these things. But sometimes they get complicated, especially because this is national level public econ in this class. That means that we're looking at problems that affect 340 million Americans. It is very, very difficult to try to coordinate 340 million Americans. We can't get them to fill out their census forms and vote on a consistent pattern for everybody in the United States doing it. How are we supposed to fix giant political and policy issues when we can't necessarily have that ability to communicate and there's not a small number of buyers and sellers and there's not low transaction costs? So in those cases, sometimes when we have these very complicated externalities, that's when there might be a point for government, when we need some sort of centralized system to come together to say, okay, this is what the people want. Let me coordinate it. Okay, so we see that a majority of people in this town really want affordable housing. So we're going to get together. We're going to put in a tax rate. We're going to take that money. We're going to bundle that money together, and then we're going to go to the developer, and we're going to subsidize the developer. It gives it one centralized hub so that some of these transactions can happen, because the majority of people in that particular situation wanted this. Now, if a majority of people did not want this, then that path would be closed, right? Because then the government would say, oh, a majority of people do not want this, and then they wouldn't do it. Or ideally, that's how it should work. Sometimes there are official or other sorts of inefficiencies that are built into the system. But that's the difference in between private and public enterprises. It's just, where's your cost and where's your benefit? Many problems involve more people or countries than can be reasonably included in negotiations. If I want to solve affordable housing or global warming or, drug use in other countries or travel mandates or, immigration policies, that's not necessarily something that I can do. That's something that needs a more coordinated effort, because it's impossible to reasonably work with everyone on it. So in these cases, having a centralized decision system can provide outcomes. A lot of times efficient outcomes, but just because it can create these outcomes do not mean that they are always efficient. But, there's varying levels, right? Sometimes most people agree that they went really well. Other times, not necessarily the same. Let's give a couple examples of just how national government has come together to correct for externalities. The Civil Rights Act in 1964, before then, a lot of people were persecuted, segregated on the basis of race, religion, color, identity, gender, so on and so forth. And the Civil Rights Act came in because there was the supply and demand in many different goods markets where people were unwilling to coordinate, and there was a lot of social harm that was being done, especially to marginalized groups. Well, the Civil Rights Act was one way to try to correct for a lot of these externalities, where people weren't able to be served in certain diners, or people weren't able to sit on certain parts of the bus. The Civil Rights Act came in to correct for a lot of these externalities and try to fix these systems. Did it do a perfect job? Yes and no. But it's one that people generally accept are, really important to the foundation of history. Right? So that's one that majority of people find to be an overwhelming success, and it's a way of correcting for some of the externalities that happened back before the 1960s. Another one that, as we go down the list, a little bit more and more debated. The next one's cross-state air pollution rules. So there's externalities where a lot of states will have very industrialized complexes, and they'll have lots of factories, and those factories blow smoke. And it turns out the smoke doesn't necessarily fall right by the factory, right? It goes up into the clouds, it kind of moves with the weather vane, and then it comes down in a different place. There's a reason why there's a bunch of soot in different parts of New York because of coal production that's happening in West Virginia, right? So the United States came in, the EPA made this rule on cross-state air pollution, and it's dealing with, okay, what do we do in these situations? And it says, okay, maybe you can pollute this much, you can't pollute this much, maybe this is the total amount of pollution, and you can trade in between this and that other state for this amount. Now that's contested because some people still want to pollute. They don't necessarily care what's happening in the other state. So this is the way that we're kind of forcing them to internalize that externality by giving additional cost to them. Is everybody happy about that? No. Are some people, the people who their homes no longer have the soot and debris on it, happy? Yeah, they totally are. So that's something that it was a complicated externality that got corrected, not necessarily in a way that makes everybody happy, but for the betterment of society, because we're trying to get supply and demand, this private supply and demand, to the societal supply and demand. Civil Rights Act, air pollution rules, prescription drug monitoring programs. That's the idea that in a lot of states, there's this externality in drug markets or in prescription markets because some people could go to multiple doctors and get prescriptions for things, and then they would end up having way too many drugs in their system, which could cause accidents while they're driving. It could cause some sort of other inefficiencies. It could cause people to act in irrational ways that may harm others. So there was these externalities happening because of this inefficiency that was happening in prescription drug markets. So a lot of states signed up for the prescription drug monitoring programs, which now have ways to like track people as they go to different nurse practitioners and doctors to see like who they see, where they get their prescriptions from, how it's their prescribing habits. And it's a way of being able to monitor these situations to try to correct for the externality that was happening of prescription drug abuse. This one's also contested, right? Some people feel it is absolutely their right to take as many prescription drugs as they want, while other people do not feel that they have the right to do that because it might cause inherent harm to the people around them or their family members. So this is something that's hotly contested, but it was a government action to try to correct for an externality. Net neutrality. Back in the Obama era, net neutrality was the idea that all cable companies had to treat everybody, or all content creators, equally, right? It's the idea that if you're creating a YouTube video in your basement and someone else who's in a multi-million-dollar company creates a YouTube video and puts it online, both of you should have the ability to show up in searches, and both of you should have the ability to run at decent speeds, right? Because both of you are allowed to come to the market. Now, if they just do way better than you because they have higher production value and stuff like that, okay, they won, but at least both of you were able to get your content out there for people to see. Repealing net neutrality makes it so that cable providers can actually change prices for people, and they can make it so that some people are really slow. So if it's your personal website from like this company that you built up from the ground up, you might be absolutely tailored down in speed, while this competing multi-million-dollar conglomerate company can just pay to have these much faster speeds that you can't access. That's repealing net neutrality. So that is very contested. Lots of larger companies really want to repeal it because they think that they should have faster speeds for Netflix and things like that, while a lot of content creators are just like, what are you talking about? We want people to still be able to find our websites and for our websites to function at a decent speed. So there's lots of different pieces to net neutrality. This one is extremely debated, and there's people on every single side. Now, in public economics, we are not supposed to, well, okay, we can take sides, but we have to at least use our economic thinking caps of the externalities and provisions on government and the provisions on people that result from a lot of these programs and changes, right? Because a lot of them are for good, where everybody can kind of agree this is for the best. Well, there's other ones that people hotly contest and think that though this was a type of way to try to correct for externalities that had happened, such as content creators getting slowed down, maybe it's not necessarily what everyone wants, which kind of comes up with a lot of issues with public sector externality fixes, right? They can absolutely try to fix things, and a lot of time they manage to do it. This is why we have rules and regulations, because it's very difficult to coordinate 7.6 billion people or 340 million Americans. Those are difficult to coordinate together, and public sector gives one venue for being able to make some decisions, right? Because they have a wider variety of things that they can do. Since they have some sort of agreement slightly from everyone, they can tax things, they can subsidize things, they can put quantity regulations, they can put price regulations, they can put quality regulations. So let's go through this. Taxes are when you pay money on money that you're making or money that you're spending. Subsidies is when you get money to be able to do more of something. Quantity regulations is when they say, okay, there's only 600 units of pollution, right? Or there's some sort of arbitrary limit on the amount of something. Price regulations is you can't change the price. That's the idea of like having an EpiPen that you can only charge so much for the EpiPen. That's a price regulation. Quality regulations, that's the idea of like occupational licensing. You have to have this minimum amount of quality to be able to exist in your job. So these are different tools that the public sector can use to try to fix and correct for some of these externalities and inefficiencies. There's also pitfalls in that, though, that we have to admit, right? Because we're social scientists, and we have to admit that there's pitfalls. Sometimes it's difficult to represent everyone's opinion and belief. That's true, right? It's very difficult to represent absolutely everyone in the United States and what they want. We tend to not unanimously agree on every decision. So trying to represent what the people want is a very difficult process. It's also subject to bureaucratic inefficiencies. Are you just throwing up all around? Okay, all right. Sorry if you hear a noise of something rolling. The cat's throwing a little jingly ball. Anyways, it's subject to bureaucratic inefficiencies. You know, sometimes we're trying to do the best for the world, but then we have to hire like 200 people, and then we have to train them, and then we have to do all these other things, and maybe there might cause lags and changes, and it might make money that's spent on like compliance costs and things like that, and inefficiencies are then built into the system, which makes it so that our externality fix causes just new externalities. Our corrective taxes are extremely difficult to measure. Back to the idea, if I have a steel company and I'm poisoning the households down the river, it's very difficult to give an exact number amount for how much their life is affected. So what am I even trying to get at the end of the day with this externalities chapter? The point of the externalities chapter is showing you that there's different effects that are happening. There's different costs and benefits that happen on the world for the world's supply and demand, or society's supply and demand, that are inherently different from our personal supply and demand. And there has to be ways to be able to correct for that, because if not, these market failures exist. And when these market failures exist, we need to try to bring them closer together. All right, everyone, that's it. Have a wonderful evening. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.